Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kadir Ustun. I'm the Executive Director here at SETA Washington. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for this event titled Implications of the Gulf Crisis for the U.S. and the Middle East. As you all know, we've had a summer that was anything but quiet, both domestically here at home with the new Trump administration going through quite a few different political crises, and but also in the region in the Middle East. We started the summer with this Gulf crisis that happened soon after President Trump's visit to the region, visit to Saudi Arabia especially. The Gulf Cooperation Council announced sanctions against Qatar, and they tried to isolate the country. And there have been many developments after that, attempts at finding a middle ground, trying to defuse the crisis. As you know, the U.S. has a base there, military base, but U.S. military has good relations with the UAE as well, different parties to this crisis. And Turkey also took a strong role in trying to defuse the crisis, but also supporting Qatar in many ways while trying to make sure sort of Saudi Arabia acted like so-called, quote-unquote, older brother. Anyway, we are here today with a very distinguished panel of experts to discuss the Gulf crisis and what it means for the region and for the U.S. policy as well. So I have to my left Amjad Atallah. He's the CEO of Vortex International, a consulting firm. Amjad recently departed from Al Jazeera. About 6 years he worked there at senior levels. He was the head of Al Jazeera Americas, I think. Thank you, Amjad, for being here. To his left, we have Jeffrey Aronson. He's the chairman and co-founder of the Mortons Group. It's a consultancy as well in the Middle East. Jeffrey Aronson, as you know, has long years. He doesn't show it, but he has long experience in the region, in the Israeli-Palestine issues, among many others. He has a long history of running Track 2 dialogues and think tank work and other kinds of policy analysis activity. We're again grateful for his presence here. To his left, Mark Perry is a foreign policy analyst, historian of the U.S. military. He's a well-accomplished, widely published author. He has published 9 books. His 10th is out.
It's coming out.
It's coming out. It's titled The Pentagon's Wars. Thank you, Mark, for being here. And to his left, Dr. Kilic, our research director here at SETA DC. He's a professor at Penn State University, and we work together, as you all know him very well. Anyway, so I want to move on to my panel discussion right away. We'll start with Amjad, and we look forward to all your comments. Thank you. Amjad, please, go ahead.
Thank you, Kadir, and thanks to SETA for organizing this. It's after 6 years in journalism where you couldn't really have a perspective or an opinion because you had to represent all sides equally. It's a little bit liberating to get back into an analyst mode. First, I'd like to respectfully suggest that this isn't a struggle between the GCC and Qatar, which tends to, just that framing tends to isolate Qatar more than the situation actually represents. It's a struggle between Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, and Qatar and Oman and Kuwait. But Qatar is the one that's singled out as the focal point for the punishment, but I think also with the intent that if Qatar capitulated to that pressure, Oman and Kuwait would also fall more in line with a more centralized decision-making in the region from Saudi Arabia. This isn't new, and the process that this is happening in isn't new. With all the PR firms that are working here in Washington now for the various governments, an American audience could be forgiven for thinking that this is about Qatar's support for the Muslim Brotherhood, or that this is about Al Jazeera and the reporting that Al Jazeera does. And news is partly to blame in a way, because 24/7 news channels, and you know, I was the editor-in-chief at Al Jazeera America. I was bureau chief at Al Jazeera English, and you know, I accept responsibility for this as well. But it's been very hard to provide historical context and long-term context for any particular news event, because you're doing a 24/7 news cycle. So every day is a new day. It's like Groundhog Day. You wake up in the morning and every story is brand new, but it's not new. It's actually the same story. And it's very hard to provide historical context without providing documentaries, without providing long-form content, which people watch much less than they do the headlines, or anything that's under a breaking news banner, which is why some news channels have a breaking news banner always on the screen nowadays. So I want to go outside of that 24/7 news cycle and go back pretty far. And my argument is that basically Saudi Arabia's policy has remained consistent regardless of who's been the king, regardless of who's been in charge. It has been pretty stable in many ways. It's a status quo power, and I think many Saudis in government would probably define their own government as a status quo power. It's been fearful, they probably wouldn't use that word, but it's been fearful of any changes in the political systems in the area, especially if they involve changes away from royalty or away from autocracies with whom Saudi Arabia was allied. When change has happened, Saudi Arabia has utilized whatever resources it had in very creative ways in an attempt to reverse those changes or to stop them, often with unintended consequences. Sometimes it's worked, sometimes it hasn't worked, but always there have been unintended consequences that then shape the region further and then require further response. And I'm just going to go through a very quick history of some of these examples, so that when we get to the point with Qatar right now, you see, oh, this is like episode 15, you know, of a series. When Saudi Arabia was at odds with Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt and with the Nasserite revolution in Egypt, they ultimately fought that battle out in Yemen with Egypt throughout the 1960s. The Saudis were on the side of the Shias, and the Egyptians were on the side of the Republican forces that were trying to overthrow the royalist system and create a different form, a Republican form that was allied with Egypt. So at that time, Saudi Arabia knew that for an international community in particular, it's best to frame the enemy as communism. It's best to frame the enemy as socialism or Nasserite. And indeed, the Soviet Union was allied with the Egyptian forces at the time. Fast forward to 1979 and the Iranian Revolution, perhaps the single greatest threat to the concept of royalty in the Middle East up until that time. So Saudi Arabia, among other states in the region, supported Saddam Hussein in an invasion of Iran only 1 year after the revolution in an attempt to overthrow the revolution. That war took almost 10 years. About 1 million people died on both sides of it. Iraqis used to have a joke that the Saudis were prepared to fight Iran to the last Iraqi man. And as soon as that war was, well, actually while that was happening, also the Soviet Union in 1979 invaded Afghanistan. Saudi Arabia also saw this as a direct threat and worked with the United States and the Pakistani intelligence agencies to fund the most conservative elements of the Mujahideen in their battle against the Soviets. Ultimately, one of the unintended consequences of that was the creation of Al-Qaeda. In 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon in an attempt to destroy the PLO, Saudi Arabia remained very silent and which was viewed by the Palestinian leadership at the time as tacit support for the invasion. The PLO at the time was not Muslim Brotherhood. It was not communist. It was a secular nationalist liberation force that was iconic throughout the global South, but demonized in Israel and the United States, of course. And the when that war ended with the PLO having to leave Lebanon, the Arabs and Saudi Arabia insisted that the PLO would not be reconstituted in one place. So all of the Palestinian soldiers were distributed among various countries, and the poor soldiers who had to go to Iraq, unfortunately, ended up having to fight for Saddam in Iran. In 1980, after the war with Iran and Iraq ended, Iraq at that time then began a competition with the Gulf countries over who actually was in charge of the region. So the Gulf countries were saying, well, you know, we bankrolled you to fight this war, we're in charge. Saddam Hussein's response was, no, I fought this war. Yeah, you paid for it because I was protecting you, and now I'm in charge. And to make his point even more clear, Saddam Hussein, you know, invaded Kuwait, as you all know. And of course, not only Saudi Arabia, but Syria and much of the international community joined the United States, not only in expelling Iraqi forces from Kuwait. The important part of that is not that they expelled the forces from Kuwait, it's that they also destroyed Iraq. The destruction of Iraq was not a prerequisite or a requirement for liberating Kuwait, but it was perhaps a central tenet of the war. And Iraq, as you know, went from being an industrialized, modern state to a pre-industrial state after that part. 2006, Israel goes to war with Lebanon in an attempt to destroy Hezbollah. Again, Saudi Arabia played the same role it did with the PLO. It stayed very silent, very quiet, which was tacitly seen in the United States, tacitly seen in the region as support for the Israeli effort. And again, the argument then could be, well, you know, we're not going to support a Shia movement that's in Lebanon, that's taking over Lebanon. But that war didn't end well for Israel. It didn't end, of course, well for Lebanon. The Israeli attacks in Gaza, 2008, 2012, 2014, played out much the same way. Again, Hamas is not a Shia organization. It's a Sunni organization. But Saudi Arabia could make the argument, but it's Muslim Brotherhood or it's related to the Muslim Brotherhood. Fast forward to the Arab Spring. An even greater threat to the status quo of the region and particularly to royalty than the Iranian Revolution. And in Saudi Arabia's eyes, that required the equivalent of a Saddam-like counter. Like if they had to fund Saddam Hussein to invade Iran, what would be the equivalent to try to counter the Arab Spring? This was harder because this was happening in Arab Sunni countries, Sunni majority countries. And so Saudi Arabia found unique ad hoc ways in each country to try to roll back the gains that were made by the revolutionary movements. Now, but there was I think for Saudi Arabia, there was a problem in that there were two major Sunni powers in the region that were actually seen to be supportive of the change movement. And those were Turkey and Qatar. And that tension effectively became outright hostility, where Saudi Arabia felt the stability of the region depended on rolling back the revolutions, rolling back Arab Spring, rolling back democracy, getting back to a situation where things were the way they were in the 1970s or maybe the way they were in the 1980s. And all of a sudden you've got these two major powers, Turkey and Qatar, which were actively, very actively helping economically, socially, culturally, politically, militarily in some cases, supporting the new governments once they came to power. Now, I think that ultimately, Saudi Arabia felt with the changes maybe in the United States that this was an appropriate time to be able to reintegrate Qatar into Saudi decision-making, so that Qatar would lose its independent foreign policy decision-making capacity, much like Bahrain, and become simply an adjunct Saudi Arabia, and I think every Qatari politician or official has been sort of making this point that the challenge against Qatar is actually existential. It's whether it remains an independent country or not. Now, it's decided that it would remain an independent country, but it's found support for that, for example, from Oman, which has exponentially increased its trade with Qatar to accommodate the blockade. Turkey, of course, has provided troops, which may have actually forestalled an invasion of, at least many Qataris believe, forestalled an invasion of Qatar. And you have, of course, Iran, which has been willing to take. Iran has been, I think, in many ways the winner of the region, not by its own action, but by its ability to take advantage of the mistakes of everybody else. So every time the United States makes a mistake, the Iranians are very good at taking advantage of it. When the Arabs make a mistake, the Iranians are very good at taking advantage of it. And the Iranians have taken the position that without being hostile to Saudi Arabia in particular, they've taken a position of trying to support Qatar. So the challenge, I think, now facing Turkey and Qatar, Oman, and I think to a lesser extent Kuwait, is whether the price to pay for a détente with Saudi Arabia will be abandoning support for their own independent foreign policy and decision-making capacity, or whether they're going to find a way of harmonizing foreign policy goals among themselves that would form a sufficient counterweight that would create a stable balance of forces in the region. The United States is, I think, in the past, I don't think you could have gotten this far in the past because the United States would have been the architect. Right? In the past, the United States, the CIA would have been involved, the Pentagon would have been involved, everybody would be running around dictating and calling up the leaders on a daily basis saying, you're not doing this, you're doing this, no, you're going to do this. And that hasn't been happening. Of course, Obama pulled back, I think, significantly from playing that role in the region, and I think this administration similarly hasn't necessarily played that kind of day-to-day, but I'll let Mark maybe correct me on that if I'm wrong. But I think that the United States is the unknown factor here because the United States could tilt this one way or another. If the United States doesn't tilt it one way or another, I think what you're looking at is going to be a rebalancing of forces in the region. Thanks.
Amjad, thank you very much. I'll turn to Kilic to talk about Turkey's role and the regional implications. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the crisis itself surprised everybody, including Turkey. Turkey was watching this tension between different Gulf countries for a while now, but Turkey wasn't expecting such a sudden escalation. And it caught Turkey in a critical juncture of its foreign policy. Turkey was, at this period, on the one hand, was mending ties with Saudi Arabia since the beginning of the, maybe a little later phases of the Arab Spring, especially after the coup in Egypt. Turkey and Saudi Arabia was at odds with each other and supporting different groups and having a lot of tension, but especially after King Salman, many people predicted that Turkey and Saudi Arabia, for the first time after 5-6 years, started to talk genuinely about the regional problems and start to reach an understanding of cooperation with each other. So this was one of the development. The other was the strengthening ties with Qatar. Again, with the beginning of the Arab Spring, Turkey and Qatar almost share the same visions in multiple different issues in regards to Arab Spring. And especially after the coup again, when the big rupture happened in the in Middle East, Qatar was basically on the same side with Turkey in denouncing the coup and supporting the pro-democracy movements around Middle East. And in the last 1 year, however, we see a sudden hike in Qatari-Turkish relation. On the one hand, the investment of Qatar in Turkey increased dramatically, starting from 2015. And secondly, when the July 15 coup attempt took place last year, the first country, I guess, that supported Turkey and endorsed the democratically elected government and sent some messages immediately to President Erdogan was Qatar. So there was a social dimension of this increasing ties as well. And the third dimension of this new, if we can call it a new era in Turkish foreign policy, was especially in the last 2 years, Turkey attempted to, especially in the Middle East, restart the dialogue. And the Turkish Prime Minister Binali Yildirim described that to have more friends in Middle East policy. So he was trying to engage with many of these countries, including Saudi Arabia. So it was a critical turning point in Turkish relations with these other countries, including United Arab Emirates. So when the crisis took place, Turkey's reaction was very careful. The first, when you look at the first statements, it was something that reminds the active neutrality policy that Turkey followed in Middle East for long years. Turkey immediately didn't denounce anyone, but said the embargo is unacceptable and it shouldn't take place. But at the same time, we see the government is following a careful, delicate balance in Middle East. And interestingly, public opinion this time especially a significant group within the grassroots of AK Party voters actually supported supported Qatar and denounced the embargo. And partly it was a psychological dimension as well. It was Ramadan. And an embargo at that significant, like the religious important point was somehow, even if you don't understand Gulf or the balances in the region, was considered unacceptable. Of course, the mixed messages of the Saudi-led coalition also confused both at the beginning the Turkish government and Turkish public opinion. So what was this position against? Was it against because Qatar was getting pro-Iranian? Or is it because Qatar is supporting extremism and terrorism, in quote? Or is it because Qatar is doing something else? So it was a little, because Turkey didn't involve in Gulf politics for a long time, didn't really understand what was going on in the region, especially public opinion. But in the meantime, when especially the 10 condition was leaked, was it 10 condition or a number of condition was leaked to mend ties with Qatar, when Turkey saw that the military base, the removal of the Turkish military base in Qatar was, I think it was the number 3 in these conditions, Turkey started to follow a more active policy. It was active neutrality with steroids maybe. It was pro-Qatar, but not anti-Saudi Arabia. So again, a delicate balance, but we are with Qatar in this. We think that, it is unfair to treat like this, but we are not against anyone. And in the meantime, the parliament passed this resolution about the Turkish base in Qatar. And just to have a short background of this agreement was signed a few years ago between Turkey and Qatar. And when the deployment of the first Turkish troops, there was already like 90 Turkish troops in the base, but when another set of deployments took place during the crisis, it created a lot of controversy and questions about Turkish intention about this. Turkey, when they signed this agreement in 2015, actually basically aimed to do several things. Number one was increasing military activism. So for last 10 years, whenever Turkey was talking in the Middle East, they were always talking about soft power, diplomatic power of Turkey, like the engagement. But Turkey in the last couple years decided to be a little more, using a little more of its hard power, start military deployment, at least, capacity building in different military bases. Somalia was one example of this, and Qatar was the second one. The second motivation of this was probably Turkey was trying to increase its capacity in terms of irregular warfare, especially with terrorist groups and the other armed militia. And they understand that this could happen in different climates and geographies. So having some base in Qatar basically, and continue the training of the Turkish troops over there, give the idea that if Turkey wants to, in the future, if they confront any kind of irregular warfare, this would be an option. And the third one is more vague. It was power projection, but power projection with no significant targets. So Turkey never claimed that it's a power projection towards anyone, but it is against anyone. But it was basically an attempt to increase Turkish capability in military outreach. And of course, in terms of Qatari-Turkish relation, when relations started to improve, the Qatari investment improved, Turkey and Qatar decided to have a military and security anchorage to the strategic partnership that is emerging as well. And this was a good idea for both countries to sign this defense cooperation agreement. And at the end of the day, they have a military dimension as well. And this military dimension is expected to create probably a social psychological dimension both in the Qatari population and in the Turkish population as well. Because of that, it was when the Turkish troops were sent to Qatar, Turkish public opinion really supported the resolution in the parliament. So the critical turning point about Turkey is this condition of removal of this base and in the Cairo meeting of the four countries. And in the meantime, Turkey's kind of trying not to escalate the rhetoric, but express its unhappiness about that condition and the presence of that condition. Turkish president make a statement saying that we even offered to have a base in Saudi Arabia. And if Saudi Arabia accepts this, we can have a base in Saudi Arabia as well. So we don't have any objection for this, and we don't like this statement. And we don't know what happened, but in the second statement, second set of conditions in Bahrain, that precondition was removed. So the four countries now don't ask Turkey to remove its base from Qatar. At this point, what is the expectations of Turkey? Turkey is, when I say Turkey, it is the analyst in Turkey, and partly the Turkish government is probably expecting that the conflict will not escalate into a full-fledged military conflict, right? The dispute will not be turned into military conflict. However, it will not de-escalate and disappear immediately. And even the phone call between the Qatari emir and the Crown Prince last week basically demonstrated that there is too many minute details that needs to be fixed in order to resolve this question. And probably the coalition, the four-country coalition, wouldn't want to lose face at this point. To remove those conditions and mend ties with Qatar without Qataris any steps will create, the losing face for these four countries. But at the same time, the embargo will have its economic effects, social effects on Qatari population as well. Qatar wouldn't want the continuation of this as well. So at this, the deadlock, although Kuwait is trying to create a dialogue, and although Emir of Qatar will be in Turkey tomorrow, and the Kuwaiti Prime Minister is in Turkey right now, so there is rumors that something is cooking, probably another attempt to mend these ties, because President was in Saudi Arabia, President Erdogan was Saudi Arabia a few weeks ago. So there is this expectation that it will prolong, but it should end in a very face-saving formula for both Qatar and the four countries, because any kind of destabilization in the region in the long run will create economic and social as well as the security problems for all of the countries in the region. And Turkey, facing multiple different security problems right now, is considering the stability of the region more important than anything else.
Well, Mark, we want to hear about how things look from... Oh, we switched.
Yeah.
We had a whole panel back there, so
We had a
now...
negotiation. If you want me to go,
Okay.
I'll do it.
Jeffrey,
Yeah.
please, go ahead.
Go ahead.
First of all, thank you to SETA and thank you all for attending today. Some years ago, I was in Cairo and talking with Nabil Fahmy, who at that point I think was still at AUB, had yet to be named foreign minister. And we were talking about the in a sense, what many people at that time considered to be sort of the nuisance value of the Qataris throughout the region, punching far above what many thought to be their appropriate weight. They were active in Gaza, they were active in Egypt with the Ikhwan, and just generally speaking, this country that many people hadn't really considered as a factor had emerged as a factor. Nabil said to me, the Qataris historically are only as strong as their other Gulf neighbors are weak. They're only able to, at that point, they were only able to operate as publicly, as effectively, and as broadly as they were, because of if not a vacuum, at least a general inability or weakness on the part of other Gulf states, principally Saudi Arabia. This raises the broader question here as we look at this crisis that I would like to focus on, and that is the fact that all of these countries are weak countries. None of them has marshaled the ability to be a game changer in certainly any positive sense throughout the region over these last decades. Even more broadly, when one looks at the Gulf countries and the Arab Middle East as a whole, one sees example after example of the inability of these nations to promote their sovereign identity and to project power. Since 1980, how many Arab capitals have actually been occupied by foreign powers? More than one, 2, 3, even 4, depending on how you count. So these, at the get-go, are weak nations who are, as a consequence, unable in many ways to break out of the straitjacket of their weakness and to emerge stronger as a consequence. So what we're seeing is nations that are hobbled by their own shortcomings, trying to work things out in a very polarized environment. The environment is polarized in many respects as a function of the weakness that pervades the region. The GCC, for example, which was established some decades ago, is in many respects merely a formalization of that weakness. It's not an expression of strength. Hasn't been a forum for mobilizing the most assertive and aggressively correct aspects of the interests of these nations themselves. So what we have now is weak nations trying to squabbling amongst each other, looking for some sense of advantage, perhaps as a means of projecting this idea of strength. And that's a very complex, unstable mix that is unlikely, whether it be in Saudi Arabia or the Gulf or anywhere else in the world. It's an unwieldy mix that's unlikely to yield positive gains in the sense of a resolution which projects expressions of strength rather than weakness. Now, for a minute or two, I'd like to talk about what that crisis offers. A crisis is a crisis, but it's also an opportunity. Now, notwithstanding everything I've said until now, there are created in this instability opportunities for those who choose to take advantage, or for those who are forced to take advantage. And primary among this aspect is the Qataris and their need to develop secure and reliable avenues for trade and commerce. and also to stabilize their own national banking systems, which suffered in the wake of the crisis, insofar as Qatari banks have been, because capital is a coward. When the Qataris were targeted, banks around the world became hesitant to lend them money, support them, and so forth. I'm not an expert on that process, but my sense is that the concerns are in the process of being overcome, and the stability of the Qatari banking system is now more secure than what it may have been some months ago. But more broadly than that, the Qataris are being forced to change not so much the terms of their trade, but the way in which their trade is conducted. It was mentioned here already that trade with Oman has increased. Trade with Pakistan is increasing without the intermediary function that Saudi Arabia used to provide and the Emirates used to provide. Trade air links with England in some respects are expanding in the north of England. So there are, and the Qatari infrastructure itself for maritime trade is now being further expanded. I think it's called the Hamad port is now operating. This isn't something you stand up in a day. So there had been a long-term effort to increase the national capacity of Qatari ports. But they've stepped in here, and rather quickly, what we've seen are new patterns of trade emerging, which have provided a national security benefit. The Qataris feel, as a consequence, much more secure, not only in the context of what's happening today, but generally speaking, their reliance on a single avenue for trade, principally through Saudi Arabia, has now been superseded by a more diffuse and therefore secure network. And that's quite important. And that represents a strategic gain over the longer term, which is perhaps not consistent with what those targeting the Qataris thought when they first embarked on this exercise. The other point here to remark upon is this expanding or new avenues of trade are occurring in a maritime environment in the Red Sea and beyond, in which you have a great game going on. You have, as anyone who has paid attention in these last months and few years, we see an extraordinary introduction of Chinese interest in Djibouti, for example, alongside the U.S., alongside France, alongside Saudi Arabia and Egypt, who are essentially renting pieces of that state in order to establish bases overlooking the Red Sea. The Emiratis are very active off the Yemeni coast, in Eritrea as well. There's, as part of, in a sense, a global contest for establishing outposts along seaways that are critical to world trade. And certainly the Red Sea and the Suez Canal are prime among those. So what we're seeing, in a sense, with the Qataris is their entry into this, because as the Qataris enable themselves to establish new avenues of trade, there are going to be factors that want to enjoy the fruits of that exercise. And they may be Pakistani. We already see Turkey involved. Certainly the Chinese may see this as an opportunity. So what we've unleashed here, inadvertently most probably, is a new dimension to the expansion of Qatari sovereignty, which was unintended. The third and perhaps last point I'd like to make is a short one, because Mark is going to address this in greater detail. And that's the role that the Americans have played here. And it's not a role that we're used to criticizing, because they aren't out front, they aren't front and center, they don't have an idea that they're seeking to impose on the parties. In fact, to the extent we know what they're doing, they seem to be on both sides of this issue. At the one point, criticizing the Qataris, on the other day, recognizing that the U.S. stationing of forces in Qatar needs to inform the degree to which Washington encourages those people seeking to destabilize Qatar. And this is understood by many countries in the region and beyond as an expression of Washington's more general retreat from the region, which may or may not be true in fact, but this is the impression that people are getting. It's the impression in some respects that this new administration is fostering. And as we all know, first impressions once made are hard to adjust and hard to rethink. So a sense that the Americans are on both sides of this, really without a specific policy compass to guide them, offering incentives to the parties to resolve their problems that actually can work. This is not necessarily the kind of impression that adds to Washington's prestige and power. And at that point, I'll turn things over to Mark. Thank you.
Mark.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks for being here. And the way I make my living is not talking about the Qatar-Saudi crisis. I make my living by writing books, history books, and publishing them. And here's how you do that. You look at an issue and you see broad, and you take a step back and you see broad and big trends. So talk about World War II and Japan. You want to take note that Japan was having a resource crisis, that the Meiji Revolution of the 19th century had not produced the kind of affluence that the Japanese leaders had thought, that Japan was bogged down in China. And so, given all these factors, they decided to attack Pearl Harbor. And that's your first blush when you write the book, and you look at all those currents and trends, and then you take a look at what really happened. And what really happened didn't have anything to do with currents and trends and economics and the price of oil or resource. It happened to do with people making decisions. Good decisions, and in the case of, let's just say, the Japanese attack on the United States, really bad decisions based on poor information, miscalculation, poor experience, young men with stupid ideas. That's how history is made. It's not made by broad trends and Sunnis and Shias and the price of oil. It's made because people make bad decisions. The bad decision on the part of the Japanese leadership, to just kind of carry out this metaphor a little bit further, was that if the Japanese attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, the United States would look at the facts and decide that it didn't really want to fight a long war and that it couldn't match Japanese production in naval shipping, and so we'd come to the table and negotiate our surrender. That's what the Japanese thought would happen. Of course, when they attacked Pearl Harbor, they didn't really attack the one spot where they should have attacked, which is our naval strength, which would have been the Brooklyn Naval Yard, which they couldn't reach. It was a stunning miscalculation made by people sitting in a room who made the decision in one day. There's an article on this in, I'll get to Qatar, hold on. There's an article on this a couple of months ago in New York Review of Books, and it's fascinating because before we hung the Japanese leaders after the war, we sat down and talked to them about why they made the decisions they made. And we just, the first question out of every military interviewer, because these were military guys interviewing the Japanese leadership, the first question out of everyone's mouth was, what were you thinking? Why would you? And as it turned out, the Japanese leaders didn't really believe, if you got them sitting alone, they didn't really believe individually that they were going to win. They did it anyway. So the United States, there were long papers written on this from the military perspective. Americans concluded that what had happened in Japan in 1941 was that the nation was taken into the grips by reckless people. Reckless people who didn't understand the impact of their actions and miscalculated the outcomes and led their country to a disaster. Now, if you're Japanese and you're sitting in the moment, it all looks very rational. And if you're the Saudis sitting in the moment, what you do looks very rational. But I can tell you from the American perspective, James Mattis and Rex Tillerson were in Australia when Saudi Arabia announced the blockade against Qatar. When they were sitting with the prime minister, they went in the back room, they looked at each other and said, where did this come from? We were taken totally by surprise. What are we going to do? What are they thinking? What is it that they're thinking? What the Saudis were thinking was, we would support them. What the United Arab Emirates were thinking was, we would support them. After all, it seemed to them as if Donald Trump, in his visit to Saudi Arabia, had signaled acquiescence, at the very least, and support for Saudi Arabia in a way that really hadn't been done during the Obama administration, which was very hesitant. So the Saudis calculated that finally they had a president of the United States who understood their worries and was willing to be tough on Iran and would support them in the war on terrorism, would hold his hand over a globe with Fatah al-Sisi and be with them. And they had no reason to doubt that when, several days later, Donald Trump in a White House in the Rose Garden said that he really worried about Qatar's support for terrorism. A signal, a message that he was given by Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, which was given to him by the UAE's ambassador to the United States. The problem with the statement was that very few people in the administration, that is to say in the access of adults, as it's called, Mattis, not just Mattis and Tillerson, Mattis, Tillerson, Dunford, McMaster, Kellogg, Ricky Waddell, the Major General, who's the number 2 at the NSC, no one knows about. Well, these guys, the access of adults, had decided that actually they didn't support Saudi Arabia's actions, that it had thrown a wrench into what the Trump administration, which was trying to create, which was a common united front of America's Sunni allies in the Gulf region to face Iran. That united front was now split. That was bad enough. But then in June and July, something else happened that really set the Saudis back on their heels. And that is that the arms agreement signed by Donald Trump passed the Senate by a vote of 53 to 47 and was opposed quietly by even some of those who voted for the agreement, including Senator Bob Corker, who said on July 13th, 1 month after the vote, the idea that support for terrorism by Saudi Arabia, the idea that support from terrorism by Qatar is the major problem in the Middle East is a myth. The support for terrorism in the Middle East that's a problem emanates from Saudi Arabia. This is from Republican Senator Bob Corker. That statement stunned Saudi Arabia, and it reverberates to this day in what is happening in the region and the American approach to this disagreement. Amjad asked me if there would be a tilt, if I could foresee a tilt coming in the American approach to this crisis. Frankly, I think a tilt has already taken place. I think that Rex Tillerson and James Mattis, and certainly the U.S. CENTCOM commander, have attempted to kind of not simply quiet this crisis, but to push Saudi Arabia back from what it considers to be a poorly designed and counterproductive policy. And I know it's a short presentation, but I'll talk more about Japan. My friend, not my friend, but my friend Bob Corker says of this crisis, it was a rookie mistake by the Crown Prince. That's Mohammed bin Salman. Added to this, let's not forget that Rex Tillerson said that we're not going to ban the Muslim Brotherhood. He said that on June 14th, which was 3 days after this. We're not going to affect the ban of the Muslim Brotherhood because they sit in parliaments all over the region. I want to end with a quote from, I have it here, yes, I have it here, from Corker, who used the words to describe what Saudi Arabia was doing in Yemen and now in Qatar, who used the words that were used by Americans who interviewed the Japanese leadership after World War II, when their cities lay in ruins. And they described, Corker described the Saudi leadership in the Qatar crisis. This is Bob Corker. He's going to be the next Secretary of State. If Tillerson leaves, he's the guy. He's not a neocon. He's what he calls a pragmatic realist. He has a better view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than Ben Cardin, a Democrat. This guy, if there's one guy I listen to, outside of John McCain, one guy I listen to and really look at in the Senate about American foreign policy. You want to figure out what Tillerson is doing, you're not going to hear it from Tillerson. Go talk to Bob Corker. Here's what he said about the Saudi Arabia policy on Qatar. He called it aggressive, counterproductive, anti-American, and reckless, which was the same kind of conclusion that the United States military came to when studying the decision-making process of the Japanese government when it made its miscalculations 60 years ago. So here's my bottom line kind of lesson for the day as a historian. I think it's undeniable. There's a Sunni-Shia split in the Middle East. There's an emerging generation of young people unemployed and disaffected who want greater freedoms. There's a counter-revolution of a deep state of military and royals who want things to stay the same. There's a big brother, little brother attitude between the Saudis and the Qataris. Let's not forget the economic and oil-based economics, the oil-based economics of the region. But history is made by people who make decisions. And in this particular crisis, we've had decisions made by people who are inexperienced, who don't understand the long-term impact of what they're doing and who have acted recklessly. The job of the United States now is to walk them back down the ladder. And that's, I believe, what we're trying to do.
Well, thank you for these great remarks by four different great experts on various aspects of this, and I'm trying to put it together in my mind. There are some running themes here, I think. I think everybody somewhat agrees that this is a reflection of at least one major regional sort of trend, which is change versus sort of status quo. It's in some ways, I would argue, a holdover from the Arab Spring, that trend. Arab Spring, many would argue, it kind of ended in Syria, it turned into a winter, and there's all these different combinations of alliances and failures, etc. But from what I'm gathering here, that under that trend is continuing to some extent. That the alignment around new governments, sort of elections, democracy, etc., versus the status quo powers, be it military or other structures, that seems to be a continuing trend. But at the same time, these we should normally, expect crises, but you're almost all arguing that this was really unexpected, and the U.S. didn't know what to do, Turkey didn't know what to do, they were cautious, etc. And then you have an inadvertent, perhaps unexpected consequence that actually strengthened, in the meantime, of sovereignty, as Jeff was arguing, of the Qatari state. So if I can put them all together like this, so let's say next year or 2 years down the road, we should probably see a crisis that will, a regional crisis somewhere at least, that will somehow be unexpected. It's going to be coming out of this dynamic in change versus status quo, and it may actually end up strengthening the weak institutions, if I could say. Maybe I'm reading too much into Jeff's point, but maybe you guys can address this. So can we lay out a sort of projection like this? Obviously, it's a thought experiment, but or am I fair to put it together like that? Amjad.
I mean, I don't like making projections. It's the surest way of being wrong, and then having somebody on tape show you that you were wrong. So I don't want to make projections. I think that as long as the trends that we're seeing, I don't see them necessarily changing. The decision-making process and policy in Saudi Arabia that Mark was alluding to is going to be there for a very long time. And so, I think that if the goal in the region is a combination of stability but also transition away from the, you said the Arab Spring turned to an Arab winter. I mean, look, there was an Arab Spring which was just simply a inevitable percolation, a response to the tyrannical autocracy and stagnancy of the region, and then a new lid came and was put on top of it again. All right, but that doesn't mean that the pressure disappeared. There was no outlets that were created as a consequence. There was nothing that said, okay, look, we're going to reimpose dictatorship on you, but in exchange, you're going to get benefits. Well, no, you're not going to get benefits. There's just going to be a reimposition of dictatorship on top of you, and everything's going to go back to the way it was, meaning the pressure remains. So the conditions that create that have created conflict are still there. All of the conditions that Mark talked about are still there, the conditions. Now, the difference might be if there was a redirection in the United States to assume a more, and I'm not advocating this, but if the United States assumed a more directional approach, which in the past hasn't necessarily been a positive thing in the Middle East, right? But that could direct things in one way or another. I prefer imagining a positive possibility, which is, I think, that regional actors develop cooperative mechanisms for moving the region forward in a way that's a win-win situation for as many of the parties involved as possible.
Let's not forget that there was I think my dating on this is right. In mid-2011, there was an article that appeared in Foreign Policy Online from an official who is a former Treasury official, now with the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, attacking Qatar. And I think it was Jonathan Schanzer wrote the piece. Oh, maybe not. And those articles continued over a series of years. Attacks on Qatar, supporting Hamas, opposing Israel, friends with Iran, not a true friend of the United States. When were we going to do something about it? And I talked to my mother. I mean, it was really a sustained and relentless effort to discredit Qatar as an American ally. And I talked to, senior military guys in the U.S. Central Command, and I said, "Are you paying attention to this?" And they said, "No, it's noise. Forget it, nothing good. You think we're going to take our base out of Qatar? We're not going to take our base out of Qatar. We're not going to do it. They're good. They're good friends of ours. They support us. Why would we do that?" Well, then the noise turned into action, right? And what has been the U.S. military response to this? We're not taking our base out of Qatar. And strange to say, all the people who were banging the table in foreign policy or Politico or wherever about how Qatar supports terrorism have been pretty quiet now, because this is a step too far. It's been made very clear, not by Barack Obama or Bernie Sanders, by Rex Tillerson, and Jim Mattis. We're not going to do this. We don't like this. This is not a good idea. That's why I say the tilt is coming back. So when I talk about the history, there is a real history here, and we need to understand that this relentless kind of attack on Qatar, I think we're going to see that kind of go away. We need Qatar. We need that base. We're going to keep it.
Yeah, we are going to keep it. But I think what we're going to have to accustom ourselves to is yet one more arena where there's a war of attrition in the Middle East that just grinds on. In this case, we won't see actual forces confronting each other and shooting at each other. But we'll see mobilization of opinion, economic efforts, and so forth to continue the fight without any real sense of what a useful resolution will be, in a sense, guiding us. It is always possible that could occur. But again, going back to my first point, these are weak states, and they rarely can mobilize the ability to act in a way that actually strengthens them. The Saudis have tried or been victimized, in a sense, in three major, or if you include Yemen, four major arenas over these last years. One was the American decision to take out Saddam Hussein, which the Saudis opposed. The second one, and in one which actually followed from that first experience, was an effort to bring the U.S. along with a policy of unseating Bashar al-Assad. That has also failed. Yemen has won a certain and important vital degree of U.S. support, but again, what we have there is a war of attrition, which is as more likely than not exposes Saudi weaknesses rather than strengths. And now we have a fourth occasion where the Saudis may have embarked on this in the expectation, and maybe they had reasonable reason to assume that there would be U.S. support for an effort to bring Qatar to heel. As Mark is just suggesting, that expectation also may be frustrated. So we have reckless decisions resulting in instability without any real roadmap to resolve them. And as the Saudi foreign minister said a day or two ago, we can go on for two years like this. The Saudis apparently have no problem with that.
Kilic.
Well, I stopped making projections since last presidential election, so I avoid doing those kind of things. But from the trend, in my first presentation, I mentioned it is my projection as well. As Jeff stated, we will see probably a prolongation of this conflict. And to go back a little bit history like Mark did, we see this kind of misperception and the consequences, the military consequences of these misperceptions in the Middle East before. The now infamous April Gillespie moment of the meeting between U.S. ambassador in Baghdad and Saddam Hussein just before the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, actually, still one of the most controversial things. And look, misperceptions usually stick out, right? And it doesn't disappear. Even about Pearl Harbor, right? When you go now, this very controversial museum in one of the shrines in Tokyo, Yasukuni Shrine, you can see that they still keep that narrative of a U.S. plot to destroy Japan.
Yeah.
So they stick here. And Saddam Hussein, until 2000, they probably was still believing that there was, like the U.S. cheated. But the most significant problem was there's a misperception. And these misperceptions, when it comes together with a young generation of new leaders, actually, it becomes more dangerous, because if you ask the ordinary man in Middle East what they are thinking about the crisis in Qatar and these countries, ordinary man would say that, this is just young men, two crown princes and the young emir of Qatar, basically, trying to put their mark on the, basically power competition among these young men. And we have to also consider that the mixed messages of the United States didn't help the crisis at the beginning at all, right? Yes, Tillerson and others supported, in one way or another, supported Qatar, but we had the president making statement after statement, tweet after tweet, basically, blaming the Qatar for supporting extremism and terrorism. And usually, when you have this kind of messy decision-making process or no decision-making process at all, you will have a very confused group of young leaders in the Middle East, and they would consider that buck stops somewhere, right? And buck stops with someone in the White House, and they would be confused about this mixed messaging. Should we escalate? Should we continue this, or should we revise our policy? I think because of that, to have a consistent U.S. policy and straightforward U.S. policy and statements would help. Even, was it last week or so, President Trump made another statement about Qatar, which was not very favorable to Qatar. So if these statements will continue, we'll probably see the continuation of this instability and prolongation of this crisis. And a lot of lobbyists in Washington, D.C. will like this idea.
I want to turn to the audience. I have a lot of comments and questions, but if we have any questions from the audience, I'll be ready to take them for sake of time. Yes. If you can introduce yourself, that would be good.
It's good.
Go ahead.
It's all good.
Yeah, just talk.
Okay.
If it's green, it's good.
Vince Ocaso, you raise your view. I think that, the instability we're seeing in the GCC, you have a lot of these, I'm very concerned about the decision making that's going on, because you have a lot of, countries on protest human rights records, you have groups of ruthless and experienced leaders. And, Jeff, you made a good point. I mean, these are, weak states, and decision making. It's all about making decisions. But my question actually is referring to the future of the GCC as a stable bloc in the region. The growing Iranian influence, the U.S. arms sales that are, we're seeing what's going on in Yemen with the cholera outbreaks, famine going on there. Can you maybe explain the future of the GCC a little bit more?
Is there specific panelists?
Jeff.
Is someone specific you wanted to present?
Oh,
Yeah.
well, I think I said it all up front. It's hard to add 1 and 1 together to get 3. If you have weak parties coming together, they aren't necessarily strengthened, or they don't present an increased ability to project power as a consequence. That may have been the idea, and it may still be the idea. And it could, under certain circumstances, make sense. But I don't think the record over the last 2 or 3 decades demonstrates that 1 + 1 can equal 3 when it comes to the GCC. My formulation of my sense that it's merely a formalization of weakness, I think is valid. Could be wrong, but that's my view.
So future of GCC is looking bleak to you. Maybe my initial question was a bit too optimistic, Jeff. That point you made about Qatar strengthening in the meantime. So you don't see that as an institutional sort of strengthening that's going to stay, and that could have an impact in the future?
Well, the short answer is no. Perhaps I don't know enough about the internal changes in Qatari decision-making that are now being sparked by this crisis. Perhaps there are. But it very well may be the case that, as someone said, this is a battle between crown princes. And in the old days, they had many battles, but now they have at their command the powers, however weak, of a state. It's not just a few guys in the middle of nowhere. It's the power of a state, and estates which are characterized by large sums of unearned money. So that's hasn't been a fruitful mix.
Do we have any more questions? Yes, please.
Hello. Hi, thank you for being here today. My name is Ali, and I'm a student at the George Washington University. I have 2 questions, actually, if that's okay. My first question is to the general panel. Do you think that a war or a military action was going to take place against Qatar? Or like a military action was ever considered against Qatar? That's my first question. And my second question is to Mr. Atallah. You mentioned the Arab Spring. Do you think that the conditions and you said the conditions that caused the conflicts are still there? So do you think that there's going to be another Arab Spring in the near future? Thank you.
Your first question was for him, too.
So the first question,
Was there a military action planned against
I mean, I don't know.
The gossip part.
I don't know if there was. I know that many of the Qataris that I've spoken with, as well as many Turks that I've spoken with, and I've also heard now anecdotally from some Americans who now have begun to accept that that was going to take place, that there was a potential attempt to use a mercenary force to move into Qatar at the beginning. But until, in journalism, we would have needed 2 or 3 sources before we could run with that story. So, but they would have to be sources either prepared to go on record or so I don't have the evidence to say that that was going to happen, but certainly I think it's a widespread belief in Qatar, certainly, that that was going to happen, and that, but for the immediate support of Turkey, with not just troops, but I believe special forces, right? I mean, they weren't just regular soldiers on deployment. They were special forces arriving, complicated the ability to do such a thing. But again, I wouldn't have evidence that that happened. As far as the Arab Spring, people are always going to yearn for freedom. You'd have to create, North Korea created, what they call a hermit kingdom, right? You have to actually block people's access to everything going on in the world in order to not actually have them want what other people have. And in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, it's one of the highest, they have one of the highest user rates of YouTube. The internet usage among Arabs is extraordinarily high. The millennial generation in the Arab world is almost the majority. So it is the majority. As a matter of fact, some countries it's like an overwhelming majority. There's no way with those conditions, with people having access to everybody else in the world, with even the ability to look at other Muslim nations, right? Everybody can recognize that the Arab world is in a historic state of backwardness, and that unless, and if you're an Arab, I happen to be an Arab, you can't accept that that's supposed to be the case. You can't accept that, yes, we're supposed to live this way. This is the way, we cannot be smarter than this. We cannot accomplish better than this. No one is going to accept that. And so ultimately, you're going to have expressions of discontent. The biggest challenge is that when you have that tight lid, and the only way that people can express discontent is through violence or terrorism or through actions that are very negative. Now, in fact, that's one of the goals of keeping the lid tight, is to make sure that you can destroy the legitimacy of opposition by making sure that the only opposition that expresses itself is violent, and it's against civilians, and or it's fundamentalist, or it's terrorist. And so that's the challenge. And there's no easy answer. That is the challenge. And so I think that there will be, though, nevertheless, Tunisia is still a relative success story, and you have movements in other countries. So I think that this will be a process, and it will continue, but I can't, I would never suggest that I know how it's going to play out.
The rest of the panel, you want to address this question? Okay. Do we have any more questions? Fine. I'll give Mark. Final comments? Okay, well, we are right on time to end the panel here, but I want to thank my panelists for this discussion, and I was trying to, in how many panels, like last panels, we keep ending up on a very negative note, and I was trying to get a sort of institution strengthening argument out of this, but we'll try next time, maybe. Thank you very much for joining us. Please join me in congratulations.